and strengthening social fabric in every part of the United Kingdom, especially those places where those things have been short supply over recent decades. And I'm completely delighted to welcome you both online and in person, which is fantastic to see some real faces before me, to this event today on when innovation systems work, what can the UK's response to the pandemic teach us about wider science and technology policy? The last 2 years are an example, whatever shortcomings there may have been, of a scientific discovery and innovation system working. And in doing so, protecting not only our health, but delivering for our economy and for our communities. Just months after COVID-19 was first detected, the UK had sequenced the virus, put in place systems to understand its mutation, to do testing at both an individual and population level, and of course, developed, funded, regulated, and manufactured or started manufacturing multiple vaccines to confer immunity. That is an extraordinary triumph that we should never cease to celebrate, and a great testament as well to the adaptability of UK science and the great assets and networks that we have in this country. But it's also proof that the government's ambitions to become a science superpower are not just, as is the case occasionally, although George can never say this, a slogan, a mere slogan, but actually a foundation and a genuine opportunity for the UK to lead the world in a range of different scientific disciplines. And that's what we're here to talk about today. What exactly were the building blocks of that success? What was the DNA, if I can use that scientific term, that made the UK's response successful? And if there were shortcomings, what can we learn from those too? Was it, for example, the architecture? George, in a previous life, was responsible for the life sciences and industrial strategy that put in place many of the institutions that proved their worth during the last 2 years. I'm sure he'll talk about some of those himself. Was it the novel funding approach and the innovative coalition brought together by the Vaccine Task Force and the approach that they took to invest in treatments early and to go big much earlier than many other countries? Was it the regulatory setup, the way the MHRA quickly adapted to simultaneous regulatory approval rather than sequential approval, and worked collaboratively with manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies? Or was it something else entirely? Those are some of the questions I'd like to get into, and reflecting on those questions, what lessons can we learn for the next pandemic, but also for a range of other scientific and technological disciplines too, because the pandemic is just one of the many challenges that we face. And as we've shown, we have great assets and networks in this country that we should bring to bear on those too. We have a truly fantastic panel of speakers here to talk to this subject. They don't really need much introduction from me, but I'm going to do it anyway. So our first speaker, who's going to give some short remarks to open the discussion and set out the government's position, is George Freeman, MP, Minister of State for Science, Research and Innovation, someone who will be known to many of you for a variety of different roles he's held over the last few years, as chairman, policy chairman in Downing Street with me, a role in which I worked very closely with George, as I say, Minister for Life Sciences, as Minister for Transport, and also as the government's life sciences advisor in a previous life. So someone with a wealth and depth of expertise. We will then hear from Baroness Blackwood, who is chair of Genomics England, former Minister of Innovation and Department for Health. She has also been a member of the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee and chairman of the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, and was an MP for many years before her elevation too. We will then hear from James Coe, Head of Sustainability, Policy and Civic Engagement at the University of Liverpool. He's worked in a variety of roles, including the NUS, but also authored the initiation document for Liverpool City Region's R&D strategy. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Lorna Meldrum, Vice President of Commercial Operations for Securus, previously Vice President for Pandemic Response Solutions, so brings a commercial perspective on the pandemic, and has worked across the world as well as Vice President for Asia Pacific, and in previous roles at GSK and Icaria, Australia. And I should say from the start, I'm extremely grateful for Securus for supporting this event allowing us to put it on. It's fantastic. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to George Freeman, but just very quickly before I do, actually, slightly contradicting myself, the rules for today are as follows. So we have just under an hour now, so we have until 4 p.m. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to speak in turn, and then I will hand over to people in the room and people online for Q&A. If you are watching online, please do send in questions because I will receive them via the wonders of modern technology, and I will try and make sure as many people as possible get in, because I'm sure there's a lot that we have to get through today, and I will finish promptly at 4 o'clock because I know that the Minister's diary is particularly precious, but so are all of yours. So without further ado, for the second time, George Freeman.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, and for those online for joining us. And can I just echo the thanks? You'll all, if you're all here, you will know well. But good policy making, good politics, good democracy, I would argue, needs vibrant think tanks. And think tanks should be reinventing themselves, eating themselves, creating themselves in a really fertile ecosystem as much as companies. And I think Onward, we work very closely together in Number 10 during a very quiet period for UK political economy. Spoiler, the biggest crisis for 50 years as the machine tried to deal with it. But I think Onward, you've done the country a real favour creating in Onward a place where progressive ideas, if I can put it like that, thinking about where we're going tomorrow and the pace at which tomorrow is coming at us, which is a theme you and I work together on in Number 10, that ministers very often can sit out where we want to go. But the truth is that the future is accelerating towards us at a pace that we've never seen before. And I think that's part of what Onward is doing, is looking out ahead. So thank you for holding this and for inviting me, the Minister for Science Superpower, to the first of this series on science superpower. And what I thought I'd do, conscious we've got some very eminent speakers, is just declare my prejudices for those who don't know me early, say a little bit about what the government's plans are to be a science superpower now, before I rush back to try and implement them. And then I'll try to actually answer the essay question, which is some reflections for the discussion on what the pandemic has really taught us. Disclaimer alert, elected in 2010 in the Cameron intake, 100 and whatever we were, 60 of us, 70 have now left one. After a 15-year career in the early stage tech venturing sector, mainly in the biosciences in 3 phases, 5 years in the 90s in venture capital. I was in the first UK biotech investor fund. We had £40 million and then £200 million, created 9 companies in 3 years, 2 phones each. It was great fun. I was surrounded by great financiers and technologists. I was the only one who wasn't. My job was to work with the poor professor who we'd chosen to form a company with, hold his or her hand through the first 18 months, and we'd hire 40, 50 people, and I'd do the 2-year operating business plan, the board, the management team, and hire the first 20, 30 staff, and then hand on to a proper manager. Then I went to run a AI toxicology prediction, early AI. I mean, it was sort of Flymo AI, really, an algorithm chucked at the pharmacopoeia of dead medicines. Most medicines have a bell curve: no effect, no effect, some effect, some effect, optimum effect, less than optimum effect, side effects, hair loss, death. And the industry spends, this is your life, right? I mean, the industry spends thick end of 15 years, every drug, 80% failure and $2 billion trying to get that curve into the optimum in the middle by reducing dose, cutting off the ends, putting a leaflet in with the drug saying, don't take it if you're suffering from any of these conditions. It's not a great way, actually, to get the right drugs to the right people. And that company that we developed was really looking back in the dustbin of dead medicines to ask, are they really failed? Or is it just a question of finding the patients in the middle where they were optimal? And most drugs have a bell curve, otherwise they're not a drug. You just need to find the sweet spot. And actually, if you start with patients, with their tissues, their genomics, their phenotypic, their hospital data, and then you start to ask, why do they respond to that drug and not that drug? You get a fast track insight into who you should be developing drugs around. And so we sold that company in 3 years to Takeda, the Japanese pharma company. And then I became a third phase of my career, started a corporate finance consulting business, going around new hospitals, universities, saying, guys, instead of spinning out lots of drug discovery companies that are quite likely to fail, why don't we embrace the genomics, the tissues, the phenomics, the hospital infrastructure, work with industry, get hospitals, universities together and create much deeper discovery laboratories where we won't lose so much value in the spin-out process, most of which I've lost most of my hair doing. So, and we set up UCL Partners, and we set up the 100 million Wyeth Scottish Enterprise for hospital, for university collaboration. So that was the background. Elected 2010, managed to get to see David Cameron. The coalition had identified the life sciences as a key growth sector. Pfizer immediately announced they were closing, which has been coming for years. And I just managed to get in early enough with Will and Rohan Silva and David Willits. There are a whole group of us to say, look, this is structural change. The sector is going through the most phenomenal transition. We need to let it change. Our job isn't to get in the way. And we should invest in the underlying technologies of tomorrow. Genomics, informatics, and try and create that joined up ecosystem where companies, they're never going to come to the UK for top price in the NHS. As a publicly funded single payer system, taxpayers would have a problem if we were the highest payers for drugs. So what is the compelling proposition that would draw people to the UK? And we set out in that first strategy that it should be the UK as the best place to discover, research, test in this new ecosystem, because we'll give you access to patients with consent and tissues and genomics and data. And Nicola can say something about GEL, which we set up in 2011. It's a pretty transformational announcement. I remember being in the room, about 5 of us. Why don't we announce we'll be the first country to sequence 100,000 NHS patients' entire genome, not just the SNP, the whole thing, put it together with their patient records, fling a computer at it and see what comes out. And it has driven actually phenomenal investment. GEL is a world-class organization in its own right. And as you say, Will, it laid the foundations actually. It meant we were able to sequence the COVID virus really fast. But there are some other things in our response that I think the pandemic has spoken to, which I'll come back to. So Minister for Life Science, then I was Minister for Agri-Tech, then Minister for Transport Tech. The Prime Minister calls me his Inca. And then he brought me back into government in September, and the conversation, I don't think he'll mind me impersonating him, really. I didn't. He said, now, Freeman, listen, I'm giving you everything you ever wanted. I'm giving you deep space, the oceans, I'm giving you genomics, I'm giving you fusion, quantum, as UK Minister for Science, Research and Innovation. And the mission is basically to do what we did for life sciences again for the next key growth sectors. But it's bigger than that. So let me just unpack, second point, what the science superpower piece is about. We've decided, and the key is the we there, in the integrated review, we set out very clearly that the UK sees we have to make a big change in our global geopolitical model as to who we are and what our economy is about. Basically, having become a service economy in the European Union with some really smart advanced manufacturing and some amazing science and silos and occasional innovation, but essentially we've become the service economy to the European Union. We now want to shift and become a science, technology, research and innovation economy in the globe. 1 foot in the European small c community of nations and researchers, but fundamentally to put some flesh on the bones of global Britain. So the vision is that we won't tax, cut or borrow our way out of the debt that has come through really being an aging structural democracy with incredibly high rates of structural healthcare costs. So the more you grow the economy, 3-4% back in the day, even then the structural deficit was growing at 5 or 6. In other speeches, I've called it the bonfire in the basement. It's those costs in the structure of our economy that are just growing quicker than we can grow the actual economy. And so the argument is the only way we'll get out of that structural deficit overhang that we so painfully paid off in the post-crash austerity, then was banged onto us again through the pandemic. The only way is to be home to sectors, companies growing not at 5-6%, but at 50, 60, 100, 200%, the fast growing sectors of tomorrow. But crucially, the superpower bit, what's that about? That's about signaling that this has to be done as part of a broader geopolitical framework. So on my whiteboard, it's left-hand side is science superpower, right-hand side innovation nation. And my argument is you can never be a science superpower if you aren't also an innovation nation, if you're not also developing science and applying it. So what do we need? What do we mean by science superpower? Firstly, world-class science, always. If you're not doing world-class science, you haven't got the basis for the rest. Secondly, making sure that UK science is tackling global grand challenges, from the melting of the ice caps to understanding the oceans to safe space to feeding 9 billion mouths. Thirdly, attracting that global R&D in as sectors reinvent themselves. There's a wall of money out there to invest into science innovation economies, so getting our share of it. Fourthly, embedding our science in values, about which the Foreign Secretary said something last week. For me and for all of us in science, science is a force for good. Scientia is a force for challenging orthodoxies, for bringing down tyrants, for driving the Enlightenment, for bringing empiricism and rigorous debate. And so we want to make sure that our global science is embedded in that. Fifth, opening up career paths. So we may have a problem, in fact, indeed we do have a problem strategically with Russia and with parts of China. So we're going to have to do global science within a framework of commitment to values, and we're going to have to be prepared to stand behind them. And harnessing all of that for geopolitical influence is science superpower. And I'd go further and say that I think this country's done as much for global security through the pandemic, COVID, Ebola, Zika emergencies as we have probably in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, you can disagree with that, but quite a lot of military people around the world and in this country would agree. And my point is really, whether it's a moot point, but we are clearly more powerful internationally through the appliance of our science than I think we've really allowed ourselves to show. So that's the mission, is to make our research ecosystem, UKRI, the research councils, all the university research I'm responsible for, the public laboratories, the world's best and most agile research ecosystem. We're going from 14 to 22 billion a year public research spend, fantastic. China's at 240 billion, American is at 180 billion a year ex-defense. So to be a superpower, the good news is money can't buy the legacy we've got here, but to be a superpower, we're going to have to do something more than just spend. We're going to have to deploy that money in a really smart way that drives really creative science. The innovation nation piece is, how do we build the Casbolt network, attract industrial R&D, scale up companies and grow clusters all around the country. And the right-hand side of my whiteboard shows the 30 will, and my argument is you won't level up by moving the Golden Triangle north, we'll level up by driving those 30 clusters all around the country. And a few lessons on the pandemic. I think the big one is people are capable of doing amazing things, extraordinary things when there's an urgency and an emergency. Leadership from individuals. I think Kate Bingham provided phenomenal leadership for the Vaccine Task Force. We're capable of producing lots of other Kate Binghams, but our system tends not to give people that level of leadership. The MHRA, of course. For me, in a way, the biggest triumph, actually, funnily enough, having banked the genomics piece, was the clinical trial. I mean, we put together not only the world's biggest clinical trial, not only the fastest, we put together the clinical trial bigger than the next 10 put together in the world in 3 months. And that is extraordinary. And that was because patients rallied. The NHS could pull the lever, people knew where to go. And that I think is a huge strength for us. And I'd also just say there's something about the urgency drove some systems thinking and engineering, the engineering mindset of, you've got to create a ventilator that's no bigger than that costs less than $60 in 3 weeks. It was sort of Apollo, is it 14 or 11? Which was the Apollo movie where they designed the ventilator. Anyway, it's Apollo movie stuff. It's and engineers do that really well, and we have a brilliant engineering tradition. To the 3 questions, how can we best leverage the new capacity? So as Minister for Life Science now, we are literally in the process of making sure we continue to invest for tomorrow. mRNA is a huge and significant technology that's here. And so we're working hard to make sure we lock that down. I think the funding mechanisms, to the second question, are too slow, too bureaucratic. I'm appalled coming back to BAYS, or BIS as it was. The decisions that used to take 3 months are now taking 12. And that's not just blaming UKRI, that's Treasury, BAYS, that's all our own assurance mechanisms. It's just too slow. We're never going to be a fleet of foot science superpower if we can't even decide what we want to do and tell ourselves within 12 months. And I think lastly, the relationship between government, research centres, universities and business. Joy of joys, I think there's a recognition post-pandemic that you might make your funding bids in silos. You might run your internal management systems in silos, but in the end, the value is really in MHRA, be able to ring up NICE, be able to ring up a hospital, And it's that. And for me, Britain, if we're going to be a science superpower, we're going to have to break the silos, which have been all too convenient for 50 years, and think much more creatively as a little science power. Actually, 22 billion, that's not a lot of money. And we're going to have to be the most creative, the most entrepreneurial, the most exciting place where you can really have a go. And if it fails, don't worry, but the successes will really fund them. And basically, for 40, 50 years, we've sort of not backed winners. Our orthodoxy on investment has been, we do market failure. But if you back failure, you're never going to win. And somehow we've got to rewire Whitehall, I think, to be in this new game of punching above our weight, which I think the good news is our weight is huge. And that's the real challenge.
George, what a way to open this discussion. You touched on so much there. I'm not going to touch on anything, but there was one thing you said at the beginning which caught my ear, which was you said that think tanks change and eat and adapt. And there's obviously the Mark Andreessen phrase, software eating the world. And if Onward can do what Andreessen Horowitz did for Silicon Valley for British politics, then we'll have succeeded. Thank you very much. And that's a brilliant introduction. You have set out a very clear vision for what the government thinks a science means, which we will take away and feed into our research. But you've also, I think, set out some really practical lessons from the last 2 years. So thank you, and I hope to get into some of those questions in the ensuing debate. Can I now come to Baroness Blackwood? Nicola.
Thank you. Well, it's fantastic to be here, and obviously very difficult to follow George, who has been a great founder of UK life sciences as we understand it today. But I'm really lucky because I get not only to chair Genomics England, I get to chair Oxford University Innovations, where we spin out companies from one of our great drivers of innovation in the UK, which was obviously part of the AstraZeneca vaccine program, which we can all be so proud of for its global impact. And I'm also on the board of the Turing Institute, where we drive AI. So I get to have this kind of bird's eye view of the things which are really working in the science innovation system in the UK, and the things where we need to drive a little bit harder in order to unlock some of the barriers. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about the architecture question and how that can really help to unlock and drive innovation, and the vision which actually George had when he started setting that up, and how we've had to amend and adjust it to make it work for delivery over the years. Because the way Genomics England started was really as a research program, the 100,000 genome project, which was to sequence the whole genome of 100,000 and to prove that this could actually work within the system. And it was really successful. It was harder than anybody thought it would be. It started in 2013, and we've really only just finished that as the research project. But in the end, 50% of cancer patients who participated had an actionable mutation, which could lead to either diagnosis or participation within a clinical trial. And over 25% of rare disease patients who participated found a diagnosis for the first time. And for any patient who has a rare disease, I do as well, they can wait for a minimum of 5 to 7 years on average. I waited for 30 years for my diagnosis. So this is life-changing stuff within our health system. But it's all very well having that as a research project. What you want is this as a clinical service within a health system. That is incredibly difficult to do. Nowhere in the world does this. At Genomics England, we have developed this during the pandemic, may I say, into a genomics medicine service. And the way Genomics England works is it is the service platform, which is the technology, the bioinformaticians, the analysis, the analytics service, plus a lot of genetic counsellors who deliver the service into the NHS with partners across the NHS. So this is an equitable service for anybody within the health service with specific cancers, but it will roll out to all of cancers that are relevant, plus rare diseases. And that is live at the moment. And the way we describe this is as an infinity loop. Genomics England sits in the middle, and clinicians can order the tests, and the samples go to Illumina, who sequence it. That comes back into Genomics England. You do the bioinformatics, that drives back into the clinical care, gives the answers to patients, but then we hold that data in an anonymized way in the National Genomics Library. We call that a reading library rather than a lending library. People, clinicians, researchers and industry have to come and look at that, so it's kept safe, and there's trust in the way that we keep that, which, given the sensitivity of that data, is really important. And then on the other side of the infinity loop, we have the researchers, and we have industry partners who can discover better diagnostics and therapeutics. And what we want to do is we want to drive that flywheel ever faster so that we can not only improve the clinical experience for clinicians and patients, but also we can improve discovery, therapeutics and diagnostics. And we can have this in the UK because we have the single biggest integrated health system in the world. And it is an extraordinary asset. We say everywhere in the world that we say everywhere in politics that we are, a science superpower. But when it comes to genomics, we really are ahead of the curve. We are in front of discovery, but we're also in front of driving this into the clinic. But what makes it even more special is we also have the UK Biobank, which is a genomics research program. And we're also delivering our Future Health, which is a 5 million data set, which will also do genomic analysis on healthy patients, looking at chronic illness. When we start joining up all of these data sets, the assets that we have for clinical care, but also for research, will be really unmatched globally. And so these are structures which help. Now I want to talk about some of the challenges that we face and which have been kind of touched upon by George, but these are what we need to do to our science system in order to make it work. Some of them, a sustainable pipeline of people and careers. We find it incredibly difficult to find bioinformaticians, analysts, geneticists, those who have the qualifications that we need. A lot of the scientists who feed our pipeline, they're on short contracts and short research programs. We find it very difficult to get the scientists that we need. And so that bit of sustainability within our people pipeline, as brilliant as we are in this UK, that needs to be strengthened. During the pandemic, we found that we had an amazing risk appetite. All of our incentives were aligned to deliver these high risk programs. But what we found is that the health system is really stressed right now. And if we want to keep driving forward with innovation, with programs like this, we need to maintain that risk appetite and that alignment of incentives. And that requires political leadership, not just from Westminster and from NHS England, but all the way through our life sciences system. We also have heard brilliantly George and Patrick talking about the deployment of government procurement as a way in which to drive forward this life science agenda. That's great, but as George has said, that needs to happen in a timely manner. We can't have 12 to 18-month procurement processes and expect that to keep up with an innovative private sector or even research environment. We will be behind the curve. And finally, we have got a good right touch regulatory environment, but that is only as good as it can match up with the kind of scale up capital and the move into an IPO and capital and analytical environment that will mean that we will keep those innovations in this country once they have got that regulatory approval. So that is the kind of pipeline that we need to be building in order to match the brilliant architecture and the brilliant scientists that we have. We've got the foundations. Now we need to build the building that will be stable on top of it, because we've proven that we can have global impact and we are brilliant, and we know what we need to do. We just have to get out and do it.
Very good. This is turning into the most optimistic and exciting event I think that Onward has ever held. James, if you can keep it up, that would be fantastic. James Coe,
as a professional northerner, I might struggle that way. So thank you very much, Nick and Joe. What I was thinking about. So I'm James. I'm the Head of Sustainability Policy and Civic Engagement for the University of Liverpool. For those of you not familiar with Liverpool, you'll know the four singers from there. There's the 3 universities, 2 football teams, one of them which isn't any good. And there is a world-leading and emergent health and life sciences cluster. And yeah, I'm also really optimistic about the future of health and life sciences. And I agree with what's gone before. It is about structures, it's about incentives, but it's also about people. How do we put the incentives in front of people to do brilliant things and allow the people who are doing brilliant things to get out of their way, and also have the right control so we achieve brilliant things for this country? And what a time it is to be having this conversation. You know, grant review is on the horizon, if you can arrive. There is the ticker review into research bureaucracy, the nurse review into system overall, ref results are out next week. It is a really exciting time to think about what can the future of that sector be like. So I'm gonna, I suppose, open this by thinking about 3 experiences we've had in Liverpool and what I think it tells us about ideal research systems. So the first, thinking about people and partnerships. So COVID-19. We have set up, in response to COVID-19, a pandemic institute. and it brings together a collection of research to predict, prevent, and respond to the next pandemic. This research span out of research into foot and mouth in the early noughties, where we put together the world's largest database of zoonotic diseases. Now, to me, this is a really interesting, I suppose, sadly tailored research environment of a long-term funding request that one day had an application which nobody could have predicted. With now advances in AI, which have occurred over the next 2 decades, we can now apply advanced AI to this database to have a better idea of where the next zoonotic diseases emerge. So when George talks about black winners and how to identify where the really good things are, there is something about our funding system of patient long-term funding for brilliant people that I think is a really good thing. The second thing that I think we learned in the COVID-19 pandemic is the cross-disciplinary nature of our research needs in tackling some of those massive challenges that our team plans to set out. The challenges we face don't respect scientific boundaries, they don't respect the funding counts set out, they have enormous complexity and involve a range of partners. So when I think about the pandemic, yes, it was about health and life sciences response, yes, about analysing zoonotic diseases, but it's also about engineering. It was also about arts and communications to put together public messaging. It was about behavioural sciences. It was about understanding geography, connections of people. It was a really, really important message that actually we are at our best when people can work together. I think the third part, I just pause on COVID-19, is has there ever been a better example of the value of research in this country and the amazing things it can do? You know, I'm a big fan of politics. I see Nolan, that's why you're in this room. But I've never seen the value of research spoken about by the public in so many terms, so often. And I think this is really important because when we are spending large amounts of the public funding on research, it requires their consent. Like, there's no getting away from the fact that when a minister in the future stands in front of the committee and says, well, ARI is a good idea, but you spent £800 million and not produced anything in the first year, what's going on? It needs to have the consent, it needs to have a common vocabulary about science. And the things that captured the imaginations for a lot of people in Liverpool was, yes, the imaginative and sort of extended science, but it was things like the university giving up its car parking spaces to nurses, or renting out our accommodation so people could stay overnight when they're working really hard. We need to combine the brilliant science with a public narrative that says, actually, there's an ecosystem here that allows amazing things to happen. So that's one of the things of COVID-19, that ecosystem, patients, people, and stories. I think it's really good. I think the second part of thinking about it is we do lots of things for people, but how do we work with them as well? Because people, as Nicola set out, should have agency and rights to be respected of the research that goes on. And to give a couple of examples again, in Liverpool, we're working on Health Innovation Liverpool, which is about training the next generation of healthcare workers who work in medicine to understand that it's going to be cross-disciplinary and involve technology advances, etc. One of the very, very core fundamentals is that we work with the people in Liverpool to understand their healthcare needs. And we look at where health inequalities are most pronounced and work with those people that affect them. So this isn't about science in a vacuum, it's about how do you translate it to make a big difference. The second part is about having partners in the right place. So when we set up the Pandemic Institute, it came off the back of partnerships during COVID-19. Liverpool City Council set up mass testing in 6 days. There was a phone call over the weekend, the chief executive said, yes, let's do it. It took great decision making. We've worked with commercial partners like Innova to understand what does the market need to respond to future pandemics. Our scientists are doing the research, which I mentioned before. City regions providing funding and backing. And the City Council provides civic infrastructure alongside the other universities in the city. It's the right partners in the right place to do the right things. As a university, we don't have to do all of it, nor can we. But it's a really important lesson of getting the structure in place that makes commercialization, scientific expertise, or consent from the people. And finally, being experts in our place at the things which we are good at. So not trying to do everything as a cluster, but really digging down into how can the Liverpool City region develop regional distinctiveness. So last week we launched our science innovation, document our perspectives, which sets out what we're going to be really good at. And from the pandemic, we are determined that we will grow like the health and life sciences sector, and R&D will become 5% of the city region's GDP. Our future is in R&D, and we want to capitalise on that. And then the final bit that I sort of want to try and make a seed set of what I think makes a great system is how do we grow those agglomeration benefits which George spoke about. And I think there's a few bits in having this really good system. So the first is we shouldn't forget about the foundational economy and the impact R&D has there. Process efficiencies, improving healthcare outcomes, etc. having a healthy and economically active workforce is the centre point of having a good R&D economy, and I think that's absolutely fundamental. I think secondly, we have a systems approach. So the university are keen to hold hands, not just our own, to achieve wider change. That's the left, as John Council. And finally, we bring partners to the region. It's not just working with people who are already with us. We're bringing new people in who can work with other businesses, other universities, etc. So when I think about a good ecosystem, I think those are three things. The lessons of COVID-19 is about people, partnerships, working with people, not just for them, and developing those agglomeration benefits so we develop economic distinctiveness in our places.
James, thank you very much. There are some really, really strong themes coming out between all of the contributions so far, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to list them. I'm just going to move straight on to Laura.
Okay, well, I think you're going to hear some themes and words coming through from both George, Nicola and James. So my name is Laura Meldrum and I'm here representing Seqirus. You probably won't be able to say that, so I'll say it again, Seqirus, which is the globe's second biggest influenza vaccine manufacturer. And we have a facility in Liverpool. 800 people work there, skilled people, a lot of whom have degrees who are coming in, and they're working all through the year, producing a couple of vaccines for influenza. For instance, we supply 90% of the seasonal influenza vaccines for the UK and about 700 million in exports and growing. But that's not what you want to hear. You want to hear about pandemic. And we have been working with governments for over 100 years. From our Australian facility, we worked during the Spanish flu on that pandemic there. Since that time, we have 30 contracts, pandemic contracts with government on influenza, pandemic influenza. And sometimes, you know, when I read the media, I get a little bit irritated because did we prepare for the wrong pandemic? Well, 4 out of 5 of the last pandemics have been influenza, and we know through the work of surveillance that there's a lot of pandemic strains out there that potentially could be more lethal and dangerous than the COVID strain that we've had. My perspective, we were looking at COVID vaccines. We partnered with the University of Queensland, like AstraZeneca partnered with the University of Oxford. And during that time, as the vaccine was going through phase 1, we spoke to 30 governments around the world. So I can talk about how the UK responded in comparison to those other governments. Unfortunately, that vaccine failed phase 1, so it's a high-risk business for testing reasons, not for efficacy. But we did go on to be the AstraZeneca hub for the Southern Hemisphere, so for Australia, New Zealand, and other countries down there. So what would I say was done really well by the UK? Well, the first thing was the Vaccines Task Force. It really was set up very speedily, and the composition of people were fantastic. So from government, from academia, but also from industry. And really a group of people who had that autonomy, the authority, and the funding to drive forward. Research is really risky, and they spread their risks in terms of technology. And in fact, I think all the technologies that they bet on came through, and they all produced effective vaccines at different time points. So really high risk, but with that autonomy and speed. And I think if we could see that as we go on, and I saw it or I heard it in your presentations, I think that would be fantastic. The next thing is the regulatory body. So the MHRA, you know, we were coming out of Europe, Brexit, they were separating out from the European Union, EMA. And what we saw was a regulatory body that was incredibly open to industry. It allowed us to discuss, ask questions, propose solutions, or they would come back with solutions. And therefore you got these rolling submissions that really helped us as industry make vaccines available, safe vaccines to the populace quicker. And I think if we can keep that that sort of vision that MHRA developed during the pandemic, I think that would be a very worthwhile for us in the UK that are in science industries. The next thing I think you also mentioned was clinical trials. The clinical trial network here in the UK is absolutely fantastic. It's so joined up, talks to one another. You get the results really quickly. It's really an asset, and we've then talked about what you can do with that data, which is really amazing. Finally, just the people that you get working together during a pandemic. So academic institutions, government, regulatory bodies, other industries. I mean, we partnered with AstraZeneca. It's almost unheard of to get big farmers working together. Everybody was doing it, working long hours, the people engaged by what we had to do. So those are the 4 big areas I think we want to try and keep. So having, for me, a goal in mind that when the next pandemic comes, we've been thrown out the challenge, can you get there in 100 days? We know for an influenza pandemic, we got there in 110 days during the 2009 pandemic with vaccine going into patients' arms. So can we do that? Can we improve upon that? Just 10 days for influenza, maybe more. But then for all those pathogens like COVID or the various variants or the different viruses that are out there, can we really challenge ourselves? Can that be what gets us all out of bed in the morning? So I think a lot of common themes running through what we've seen, and it's been good to be on the industry end and see those fantastic operations running through the backbone of science in the UK.
Fantastic, Laura. Well, thank you so much. And you're totally right. Some very strong themes coming through everyone. A very strong focus on the importance of capability of people and having the right people in place from a mixture of backgrounds. Very strong focusing on the long term, backing people, giving them autonomy to take risks and to deliver over a time period and to accept that there are risks in that. There's a really interesting question that's been brought out in a number of different people's remarks around institutional capacity and the importance of having a number of different institutions providing different roles incentivized together in a network, but having a degree of autonomy themselves. And then there's just this really strong question of, or this kind of burning question of speed and urgency. And just a big challenge, I think, for all of us to make sure that with another pandemic potentially around the corner, we don't lose that speed and urgency in the meantime, and then look back in 2, 5, 10 years' time and think, why on earth did we let that kind of wither on the vine rather than sustain it in the meantime? Anyway, I'm going to shut up now because you've all got burning questions. My phone is going off the hook with lots of questions too. So can I open up to the floor in the room for one round of questions, then I'll do a round of online questions too. So if you could introduce yourself and keep the questions quite brief, just in the interest of time. So here at the beginning.
Thank you. I'm Rachel Saunders. I'm from Speakers Schools. It's been brilliant to be, a real privilege to be, really exciting. I feel more optimistic about the future of my country than I had in a long time. It's amazing. It's really wonderful to hear it, which makes me think, how can we make sure that more people hear the story and are inspired by the collective work that's happening? So I'll come back to you specific. I mean, my question is, how do we make sure that young people in whatever stage they're in education understand the incredible future there is for them in terms of working in the future in these industries? I suppose Martha is, I'll get in touch and see what contribution we can make to that. But more broadly, how do we make sure that one side of government is talking to the other in terms of brilliant work going on in sciences? How does the FA encourage educators to go about it?
Fantastic. Do we have any more questions in the room? Because I'm going to take a number of questions at a time, just in the interest. So, okay, we've got one more in the room.
Thank you. I'd echo those comments about it.
Could you introduce yourself?
Of course, my name is George. I'm Jones, work for an organisation called Barriers Innovation, which echo those comments about a really, really interesting and engaging session. George, you said something at the start about the importance of not backing failure, but I wonder whether any of the panelists could share the importance of a culture that, in the right times, embraces failure, the importance of learning from those unsuccessful mistakes.
Fantastic. Why don't we take, actually, there's one more just gone on the back. I'll take that too, and then we'll.
My name is Sebastian. I'm scientists of the NHS. You all mentioned the importance of people and developing skills. But what does that look like practically? So I think, Baroness Blackwood, you mentioned that a lot of scientists want short-term contracts. So what does that look like practically as bringing those people through?
Okay, so we've got 3 questions there. For those tuning in online who may not have been able to hear those because of microphones pointing this way, there was a question about how do we inspire younger people with the optimistic and positive vision that we heard today and inspire them to go into STEM careers and into UK science. There's a question about whether or not there is a point about moments where we should be embracing failure, and a question about what developing skills looks like in practice. How do we make that happen? George, could I come to you first on those 3, and then I'm going to let
Brilliant questions. Rachel, you could feel everyone in the room nodding, and we all need to get out and about. I do a school every Friday, but that's not really the point. We'd love to take you up on the offer. I work closely with Michelle Donnellan, Minister of Skills and University Minister, but if we could get every primary school teacher to understand what's coming, they don't have to endorse everything the government does, but just to understand the scale of it, I think we could really seed a next generation of interest. If we don't, we may have the ability to be a superpower, but we won't have the people wanting to do it. George, on your point about backing failure, I did actually make the point that what we need to do is be braver in allocations, allow people to have a go, and if it fails, not worry. So we absolutely need to give people the freedom to fail. My point was more that the government orthodoxy for 40 years has been, we only back failures, basically. Our rationale for intervention is market failure. Well, there may be an argument for the market having failed and we should step in, but if that's your only orthodoxy, you will not be backing winners. And one of the most disappointing things I get is lots of top companies saying the systems at Innovate UK are too slow for us to get funding. So we're not backing our fastest growing companies, but we absolutely need a culture in academia of being allowed to fail. I mean, once, maybe twice, not every time. If someone's failing every time, they're probably in the wrong field. And Sebastian, so I think you make a really important point about clinical science. One of the things I was trying to do as Minister for Life Science is create a career ecosystem, sort of the NIHR badged, world-class, clinical trials nurse, informatician. I think through GEL, we've created an ecosystem where people around the world would say, I trained in the UK, best place to train, and the values of the NHS. And what I'm doing in other fields is pushing UKRI very hard with their 26 billion allocation to launch some flagship fellowships for some of the key skills that we need across the ecosystem, including entrepreneurship, helping scientists be entrepreneurial without losing all their academic benefits. We have to make it easy for people to drive this superpower.
George, thank you very much. I'm going to come to Nicola next, if that's all right.
Yeah. So I think on the public communication, this is mission critical. I think we really learned that in the pandemic. And there's 3 groups I think we need to support for this communication. One is the participants and patients who should firstly be involved in developing these structures and so on. At Genomics England, we have what's called a participant panel, people who have been part of our programs, and they not only feedback on the way in which we structure Genomics England, but also who gets access to the data. And they are great advocates for what we're doing because they have a stake in it. And so I think that is the first group. The second group is obviously scientists. And I think we could do more about training scientists to communicate and help and supporting them when they go out in the media. And I think Royal Colleges had a great role to play in that. And I think that's already being picked up. And the final is politicians. I can say this, very few politicians have a scientific or data training background. There's a great Royal Society pairing scheme, which I've done 3 times actually, where you do a week with scientists and the scientists come and does a week with you. It's win-win. They learn about politics, you learn about science. I think that could really be extended to provide more analytical support, training, understanding that how to communicate science and understand some of the data-driven decisions you're having to make. I mean, in my first year as an MP, I had to make a decision about pensions reform, which I didn't know anything about, and is hugely data driven. And I could really have done with some backup on sort of decisions like that. And so that's that one. On failure, agree 100%. Treasury wants to take risks, but there is not really a tolerance of failure amongst our political climate, and we need to work very hard to improve that. But it's not an easy thing to do. The Daily Mail would not agree with many of those decisions, so that's something to navigate. Support for people, I think, is something that has to be top of the agenda. I think having a multi-year financial settlement is the first step. Having a 10-year innovation strategy is another one. But I think in order to address the short-term contracts, one of the things that needs to be done is to have the longer-term contracts. Another thing that needs to be done is to have better reviewers for research applications that come through, which can be interdisciplinary. At the moment, if you get a bad reviewer, it can be catastrophic, and you can spend all your time doing funding applications and never get through because of that. And other funding bodies have actually done a really good job at improving that, not in the UK yet, and we can do better. And I think we should really focus on that, and also doing things like not putting out a funding call the week before Christmas that you have to put in the week after Christmas and things like that. And also having maternity cover and paternity cover for PIs and things like that. I mean, there is a lot we can do to improve the environment, and it's all been raised. We just need to find a way to do it. I'm going to shut up.
No, thank you very much, Nicola. In the interest of time, I'm going to take a couple of questions from online and then wrap up, because I'm very conscious of people's diaries. So, James, there's a question specifically for you, which may be kind of nitpicking at something you said, but you said the question is, how can we have a life sciences cluster in Liverpool that is both world leading and emergent at the same time? How are you defining world leading and emergent in that?
Well, I mean, the England football team's both world leading and emergent. So, yeah, I can't be saying. Yeah, so to look at a couple of, so just to, well, I didn't really know anything, but just look at the previous three really quickly. Young people, nearly half the people working in universities aren't in academic jobs. Some of the real heroes of the pandemics were the cleaners, the lab technicians, the engineers, kept that going. Promoting those careers and having a very consistent things really popular. To go back to the other points about the failure, and to wrap into that question. I mean, we are feeling our ways through what the future of the R&D ecosystem in the UK will look like. So when I think about something like the, the Pandemic Institute, millions of pounds of investment into an ambition that is nothing less than predicting and preventing the next pandemic. That is precisely the thing we should be doing. It is, a unique asset and it's world leading. Will everything go right every time? No, of course it won't. But there is something to be proud of the fact that we are doing it. To give another example, Connected Health Cities that was in Manchester in the north a few years ago. Millions of pounds to all the leaders to work within health systems to work out what works. Not all of that is going to work all the time, but by allowing the endurance of failure and saying, here's some broad parameters, go and work in it, new leaders will emerge, and that will happen. I think that's brilliant. I suppose the founder bill, how can you be both emergent and world leading? Well, we'll find out. I mean, these things take time for research to come to the fore. The public investment is welcome. It should drive in further private investment. Something like ARIA, the Advanced Research Innovation Agency, there's some skepticism about it, but actually putting a lot of funding into something and seeing what's work. As people who say we believe in science, we believe in experimentation, we should support it and see what happens. So I think that's how we have those two things.
Can I just say, Will, I think a lot of clusters actually are in the UK world-class and emergent. So to be world-class, you have to have world-class science. Liverpool does, tick. World-class clinical research, tick. World-class infrastructure, tick. Global reputation as a cluster, not quite there yet. And so one of the things we're trying to do is help clusters that are world-class build that global profile.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Lorna, I'm going to come to you partly for a last word, but we've had a question coming through about the significant investment the government's putting in. So moving from 14 to 20 billion, as George says, there are still questions about how that money is all going to be spent and how it can be best spent effectively. I guess the kind of question is, given, as George said, that 22 billion is relatively small compared to some other countries, how can the UK get best bang for its buck against the likes of China, the US, Australia, others, to ensure that we spend their money wisely and crowd in private sector investment from people like?
Yeah, so I suppose, and it's great to know that fund is there, and it's certainly not insignificant. I would say, as an industry partner, we sometimes need real help being guided through government. Who should we go to first? Describe what our proposal is, looking for that joint working together. We do a lot of work with BARDA, and we have very close dialogue with them, and they guide us through the funding mechanisms. And sometimes, I was reading up on ARIA, where do you go? How does it fit in with the other funds that are there? So I think for the UK to really maximize that private public partnership, it's also having someone that can help you guide you through the various parts of government and the bureaucracies and sort of hold your hand. And I think our experience of BARDA is very much that. And also, you know, working with them on our different technologies, our new technologies. And, you know, I heard the word mistake. It's a word I really go, things fail, but if they're well thought through, you know, you have innovative platforms, they've got to be tested, they fail, but they're not necessarily a mistake. And some of the great therapies that we've seen come out for COVID, some of the mRNA vaccines, that work was done on SARS or MERS or Zika. It might not have worked there, or the R&D might have stopped, but it then led to something greater. So just that word mistake, I feel is not right, but that's what I would advocate for, a sort of guiding path through government and working together on funding.
Thank you very much, Lorna, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. We could have gone on for a lot longer, and I'm very grateful for all of you turning up in person. I realise that may be a novelty for some of you, and anyone tuning in online to give up your precious time to be part of this discussion. It's been an incredibly optimistic discussion, I said earlier, but also a very, very important one. I think it's very hard to underestimate the significance of the last few years on the UK's science ecosystem, and the potential for the UK to come on light years in the next few years if we take the right decisions. And the government is really putting both financial muscle but also intellectual capital behind this agenda, which is something we at Onward hugely welcome. We are at Onward just launching at the moment a major program of work called Becoming a Science Superpower, which is kind of wanting to kind of get into the meat of this discussion, really understand both the kind of big conceptual questions, as George says. The word science superpower denotes quite a big shift in government policy, and does get you into questions of values and international networks and geopolitics as well, which is something we are investigating at the moment with our first paper. But we also want to get into the nuts and bolts. So how do you speed up the system? How do you make sure funding gets to the right people in the right places at the right time to drive all of those ideas towards not just discovery, but to application as well, and how can we make best use of this institutional architecture that we've been talking about today to leverage all of our scientific capabilities for the good of the economy of the UK, but also for the world, especially as global threats emerge on the horizon. So this is an incredibly exciting agenda. It's I'm delighted that Onward's able to bring together discussions such as this and to do research on this topic, because I think it's fundamental to the next few years of British politics. So I'm very, very grateful to everyone for being here today. I'm particularly grateful to Securus for supporting the discussion. We've got further events in this series. I'm grateful to BAE and Relics and others for being part of that series, which will be running over the next few months. So please come back, and I hope our panelists will follow those discussions as well as being part of this one. And it just leaves me to ask you all to put your hands together and thank our panelists today. Thank you.